Welcome, welcome to all of you on this absolutely gorgeous day. We should be doing this outside, of course, but we'll do our best to shed some light, not to match the sunshine, but at least to complement it. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Linda Longmire. I'm professor in the Global Studies Department and one of the 3 co-directors of the International Scene Lecture Series and a proud member of CCE and IPS and other good organizations here on campus. So today, this is also Women's History Month, as I'm sure all of you know, and there are an array of flyers about wonderful events on campus. We tend to encourage vigorous participation and dialogue. There'll also be a copy of our guest speaker's book and an array of other information in the back, so peruse and ponder. So today, I'm just going to turn things over to my colleague, Stephanie Nannis, who's in the political science department, is our Middle East expert in Middle Eastern politics. And so we are so delighted, and she will introduce our guest speaker for the day. I think you know the format, and Stephanie will remind you. We'll have a talk for about half an hour, and then commentary from another of our wonderful colleagues, David Green. But let me just say what a treasure Stephanie is as a colleague in these really challenging times where understanding what's going on in the Middle East is more important than ever. We cherish her expertise and participation. So, Stephanie?
That's nice. Thank you. That's very nice, Linda. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Stephanie Nannis in the Political Science Department. I do teach classes on Middle East politics. Registration's coming up. My class on general Middle East politics, Poli-Sci 108. You're all invited to join me. But today we are very pleased to welcome Phyllis Bennis back to Hofstra today. Phyllis is a program director. There are some others. So a program director at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Excuse me, where she directs the Institute's New Internationalism project. The New International Project focuses on education, activism, and advocacy to change U.S. policies away from militarism and towards diplomacy. It works to democratize and empower the United Nations in its fight for peace and human rights. So although Phyllis is here to talk about the Middle East, it's important to understand that her work is in a much larger context of trying to influence U.S. policy in a very different direction. Her work, again, though, focuses very much on the Middle East, particularly Palestinian rights. She also does work on, as it says, U.S. militarism and ways to reform the UN. She is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, which sounds like a sort of a related sister institution. And yes, definitely Women's History Month, sister institution. In 2001, she helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And more recently, she spent 6 years on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is was very active in these protests opposing the war in Gaza and on behalf of a ceasefire. And she is now an international advisor for Jewish Voice for Peace. She works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the United States and around the world. She has addressed the UN General Assembly, served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues, and was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. Phyllis has written and edited 11 books, including her very popular Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, which was updated in 2019. She is also another sort of selection of her books includes Before and After U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, and Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power. Welcome, Phyllis. We're very much looking forward to listening and speaking with you.
Thank you. First thing you always have to do, lower the mic and turn off. Can I do that? Can I shut this? Nothing will blow up if I do? Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, especially when it is so incredibly gorgeous out there. How many of you would really rather be outside on the grass? Okay, you're lying. I know you are. But thanks to Hofstra and to the International Scene Lecture Series, thanks Stephanie and all of you for coming to talk about what are some really important and somewhat difficult issues. This has been a time, this last year, this last 17 months, it's been a moment of head-spinning, crisis after crisis, and how to, this is not working very well. Let me see if I can move this. That's good. It's just been a very tough time, I think, for all of us. It's hard to talk about some of these crises. It's hard to talk about what's happening domestically here in the United States. It's what? They did what? Every day, it seems. And on the international scale, it's difficult as well. I'm going to talk today mostly about the Middle East. There's connections to other aspects, but mostly about the crisis that's been going on, especially in Gaza. This has been a very difficult 17 months for, I think, all of us, even more than usual, because the situation on the ground has been far worse than usual, and usual has been pretty bad for a pretty long time. And it's harder, in some ways, to talk about this question than it used to be. There's let's say, a higher stand, the history we're hearing, the history we're being taught. A lot of it depends on when you start the clock. If we start the clock on October 7th, we will get one set of very specific understandings of history. Palestinians on October 7th, led by Hamas, attacked inside Israel on the other side of the wall that Israel had constructed around Gaza, broke through the wall, and attacked first military targets and then hundreds of civilians. Hundreds of civilians were killed that day. Violation of international law. It's a war crime to kill civilians. So that was one moment of starting the clock. If you start on October 8th, you get a very different history in terms of the answer to that day's assault was a collective punishment of 2 million people who are continuing to be the ones suffering from that response. If you go back to 17 years before that, you get a very different history still. That was the year that Israel imposed a full embargo, siege, you can use many different words for it, but decided that Gaza would no longer be an area where you could go in and out freely, that people who lived there could come out and people could go in. All of a sudden, you couldn't go in or out without Israeli permission, and nobody got it. So you had, among other things, some of the young people who participated in the horrific events of October 7th were people whose entire life had been spent behind a wall, living in this tiny area of land, one of the most crowded, densely populated areas on Earth. And a siege was the right term in many ways because it meant the absolute lack of access to the basic things of life: clean water, electricity, food, healthcare. All of those were cut off, allowed in small amounts, and then withheld again. And you had a situation very similar to what the United States did in Iraq in the 1990s during the years of the U.S. Occupation of Iraq after the Gulf War of 1991, where you had a decision being made by committees in Washington, in New York, about how many calories per day would be needed by the entire population of Iraq, and no more than that would be allowed in. The Israeli government had that same meeting. They decided how many calories would be allowed into Gaza on a daily basis. And it also meant what foods would be allowed and what wouldn't. So flour was allowed for bread, but pasta, no. Pasta was a luxury. Chocolate, forget it, because children in Gaza should not have candy. So that was the siege that was imposed in 2006 and 7 and has lasted throughout that time. Then if you skip back further than that, if you go back 58 years to 1967, you have the military occupation of Gaza that Israel carried out in the 67 war and occupied Gaza ever since that time. And that looked different over the years at different times. For a while, it was direct military occupation with soldiers stationed within the Gaza Strip, with Israeli settlements built in the Gaza Strip, taking Palestinian land. And those settlers were removed by the Israeli government in 2005, and the soldiers were redeployed. They weren't removed. They were redeployed from inside Gaza to just outside the wall that was built at the same time. So the siege remained. That's if you start in 1967. If you go back still further, you go back to 1947-48, 80% of the population of Gaza came to Gaza in 1947-48 during what Palestinians call the Nakba. The word means catastrophe in Arabic, but it's the word that's used to describe what happened with the creation of the State of Israel, when 750,000 Palestinians, mainly in the southern and western parts, were dispossessed of their land. They were kicked out. Many of them left thinking they would be back in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. They left with the keys to their house. They locked their house, took the keys, thinking they would return. Because International says that people that are forced to flee during wartime have the right to return. Period, full stop. Not if the government that comes into power likes that idea, but because it's an internationally guaranteed right. Israel said, no, we're not going to allow them to return. And that grouping of people, 80% of the population of Gaza is made up of refugees. Before this ever happened, before any of this crisis ever happened, they came to Gaza as refugees who were never allowed to go home, even to visit their homes. So how we understand history depends a lot on when we start the clock. A lot of clocks in the United States, unfortunately, began on October 7th. People had never cared what time it was before then, apparently. And so you get people saying, this started on October 7th. Well, no, it didn't. A certain aspect of it did, but it didn't start then. It has a history that goes back. And if we're serious about preventing things like these acts of violence from ever happening again, it's crucial that we understand where it comes from. Doesn't mean supporting it, but it does mean understanding what gives rise to it, what causes it to happen, and how can we change those circumstances. It also is important when you look at questions of international law, because international law on some of these questions is pretty straightforward. So, for example, in the question of using military force is legal in international law for an occupied population. They have the right to fight for liberation from that occupation, including the use of military force. They do not have the right to use it against civilians. So you have to make that distinction. And that's one of the things that was also left out of the understanding of what happened on October 7th. But I want to talk more about one aspect of this crisis that hasn't changed as much as we might have hoped it would, which is the role of the United States, the role of our government, our tax dollars, what the government does in our name. And the U.S. role has become much clearer for a lot more people through these 17 months, I think. Because as the genocide, and I use the term very carefully, this was what the International Court of Justice said is plausibly the case. They have not made a final ruling. Their interim ruling was that Israeli actions are plausibly genocidal. I think many other experts, human rights people, et cetera, have said that it is already genocidal. Those actions were enabled by our government. Many of you know that for the last 20 years or more, the U.S. has had a legally binding obligation to pay Israel a certain amount of billions of dollars in aid each year. It was $3.2 billion a year for a long time. And then in 1916, Obama renegotiated the agreement, brought it up to $3.8 billion, and it's all military. It used to be divided between military and economic aid. The Israelis said, we don't really need economic aid, which is, of course, true. They're, I think, depending on whether you believe the CIA or the World Bank, because they have slightly different lists. But Israel is either, I think it's, if I remember right, I haven't looked at this in a couple of weeks, it's either the 23rd or the 27th per capita wealthiest country in the world. It's something like that. It's a wealthy country. So, and they're right, they don't need economic aid. But part of their wealth happens because we end up paying what turns out to be 40% of their military budget. So the U.S. every year has provided $3.8 billion. This last year, when Israel escalated its assault on the Palestinian people, not on Hamas, who they could not separate out, we spent $17 billion, not 3.8, that was used directly by the Israeli military with no restrictions, unlike the military aid that goes to every other country that is bound not only by international law, which was violated here, but also U.S. law. The Leahy Act, the Arms Export Control Act, the presidential policy finding that each president passes, Biden did it on day one of his term, which was to say that no military aid would be allowed to be sent to any country that was stopping U.S. humanitarian aid from entering to people in need. That's precisely what Israel was doing throughout these 17 months. And USAID, ironically, which you've all been hearing about, how it's being dismantled right now, USAID, part of the State Department, issued a report saying Israel is preventing humanitarian aid from getting in and should not qualify for military aid as a result. And Secretary of State Blinken hid that report, refused to make it public, and he went out and told Congress specifically, we do not have evidence. We do not have evidence that Israel is preventing humanitarian aid from getting in. It was a complete falsehood. But they got away with it, and the military aid continued. If you add on to that the about $5 billion more, something like that, that the U.S. spent on its own troops for its own assistance to Israel in the region, it gets up to more than $22 billion just last year. That's a huge amount of money, an enormous amount of money. And if we look at that in the context of what money could be used for in this country, when we're seeing these cuts going on, about to be a massive cut in Medicaid, almost certainly, although they deny it so far. But already we're talking about cuts in education, in healthcare, in jobs, all of these things. And yet, the money that goes to the Israeli military is always protected. So there have been military attacks on Gaza before. The first massive one was in 2008 and 2009 over that New Year's period. There was another in 2012. There was a giant one in 2014 that went on for 55 days and left more than 2,200 Palestinians dead. That is part of the violence of occupation. That is part of the violence of occupation. And we have, in that context, a massive escalation from that, with the attacks on the entire population in violation of a whole host of international laws, the Geneva Conventions that prohibit collective punishment, prohibit the use of force in a way that does not distinguish between civilians and civilians and fighters. And then we have the Israeli statements that started within hours of October 7th and have continued pretty much till now, where top-ranking Israeli military officials, political leaders, media commentators, all kinds of influential people across the country, some with access to power, some right at the top of the government, including the secretaries of defense, the prime minister, the president, you name it, they all made statements on the order of, these are human animals and we will treat them as such. These are animals, the children should be, denying people access to food, water, electricity, etc., creating conditions where babies die of hunger. All of those are creating conditions of life that make life for the group impossible, no matter how many people are or are not killed. So we're up to 3 already that Israel has committed during this time. The 4th has to do with separating children from their parents or making birth impossible, which is also one of the things that's happened because there's been no medical assistance to women giving birth in Gaza. There's something like 150 women give birth in Gaza almost every day. And they do so in torn tents with no medical assistance because there is nothing left. All the hospitals have been either completely destroyed or damaged to the point of barely able to function in some small pieces. So one of the things that make genocide cases historically very hard to bring is that people always said, well, it's easy to prove what acts were taken. It's not so easy to prove that they had a specific intent, which, you know, it's very similar in some ways. Are any of you pre-law students? Any of you planning to be lawyers? A few of you. One of the things you'll learn in first-year law school in crimes, the course on crimes, is that specific intent crimes are different than other crimes. So if you go up and, I don't know, break open a car, and because you're, you know, young and stupid and you just want to, that's one kind of crime. If you break into a car in order to steal something in that car, that's a worse crime in a sense. It's a more serious crime because you had a specific intent to do it. It's not just something you did as you walked down the street. So the same is true with, you know, mass killings, with creating conditions that are impossible to survive in, all those things. And that doesn't usually present itself in any overt way. You have to kind of infer it from what people say, how it matches what they do. In the case of Israel, and this was argued very passionately by the South African team in The Hague, in the International Court of Justice, was to say, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And it's deserved because these people are, and then go off into your list of insults and, you know, evidence of not taking people seriously as human beings. So this time it was much easier to make that claim. I think that it was not a very long time before the question of genocide began to, sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so. Before the question of genocide became sort of an issue in popular discourse. You know, it was online, it was viral. In the mainstream media, accusations were being heard, even though it was often said without any evidence or without sufficient evidence. And then over time, those caveats started to disappear because it became much clearer exactly what was, in fact, underway. And in that context, it meant that this was the first globally visible genocide that had ever happened in the history of the world. If you look back at the 20th century, the first genocide of the 20th century, interestingly, was also Germany. It wasn't the Holocaust. That was probably the second. There may have been some in between. But the first was in what is now Namibia, what was then called Southwest Africa, where the German colonial forces murdered huge numbers of indigenous people deliberately to get rid of them because they were kind of in the way of their colonial project. So the question of genocide, of course, it didn't have a word for it until later, until after the Holocaust. That was when the word became something that was understood around the world, that it wasn't just about killing individual people. It was about killing a people. It was about destroying a people or trying to do so. So that, I think, is an important thing to understand. None of that had ever happened in plain vision the way this one has played out and continues to do so. I must say, Israel made a great effort and was largely successful at keeping out international journalists from Gaza. They can do that because Gaza is completely surrounded by this wall and by soldiers, etc. They rebuilt the wall very quickly after the Palestinians inside had burst through the wall. And that meant they could actually keep them out. But what was new now was, number one, even mainstream media, let alone alternative media and online media and other alternative sources, were all taking seriously Palestinian journalists who paid an extraordinary price. Over 128 Palestinian journalists were killed in the first year of the war in Gaza. And their reports, often just taken on their phones, bits of videos and a little bit of sound sent out into the ether to be picked up. And then people would call in to say what it was, to clarify all of that. You had that, and you had social media. So on the brief moments that there would be an hour of electricity, the first thing Palestinians would do that were not working in hospitals, where the first thing was to reconnect the instruments of the hospital, what ordinary Palestinians would do would be to charge their phones so they could continue to send information out into the world. And the result has been this extraordinary level of familiarity around the world with what has been happening in Gaza. That had never happened before. And one of the things it led to here in the United States, where there had been a movement for Palestinian rights for decades, a strong movement, a powerful movement, but a movement that had never had very much access to actual policy shifts to power. Suddenly, you had a spontaneous response at the human level from people across this country saying, this is not okay. This is not okay. And every time you had President Biden, Vice President Harris, too many members of Congress of all parties, this is a non-sectarian, non-partisan problem, coming out and saying, we stand with Israel. And maybe adding at the end, and we wish they would not kill quite so many Palestinians. People were saying, no, that's not okay. That's not okay. We are paying for this. There was a reason that so much of the allocations were coming directly in congressional orders, not going to Congress, because members of Congress didn't want to vote for it. When it came up, they did. They did. They voted for everyone that came to them. But there were efforts. By November, 19 members of the Senate voted to support the call for what's called a joint resolution of, not defiance, of, I'm blocking the name, somebody help me here. It's JRD, but it's a joint resolution, House and Senate, of opposition to an allocation that the White House wants to make, in this case, billions of dollars going to Israel. Bernie Sanders led that in the Senate, and 19 senators voted for it, which of course was not enough to stop it. But 19 senators was 40% of the Democrats in the Senate. That had never happened before. That had never happened before. And it comes back to this movement that emerged, where people responded at a human level to say, I'm not going to stand by and let this happen. And we're talking about people who never paid that much attention to Israel, to Palestine, to the Middle East, to any of that, who had other, maybe they were activists working on other issues. In many cases, they weren't activists at all, had never sort of taken on responsibility to respond or reply or react to things that the government was doing around the world, never really bothered. And suddenly, there were hundreds of thousands and collectively millions, literally millions of people across this country coming out to say, we need a ceasefire now. Ceasefire now. It was an incredible moment. And what was particularly extraordinary about it was that the Palestinian rights movement, let's see if I can say this in a polite way, was never very well known for message discipline, right? You have a ton of organizations, and they go out and they say different things, and they sometimes contradict each other and whatever. It was never that disciplined an organization. But suddenly, you have this massive mobilization. It's not an organization. It's a movement that erupted spontaneously, that is maintaining this extraordinary level of message discipline, but at the same time was able to redefine what that message meant and what that message required to make it real. So at first it was just this desperate cry, ceasefire now. And very soon it became permanent ceasefire now, because a temporary moment was certainly not going to work. And then something else happened. People started saying, and a ceasefire isn't just stopping the bombing. It starts with stopping the bombing, but it has to also include the massive access to humanitarian aid, which had been by that time completely cut off, so that we need hundreds of trucks every day getting into Gaza, where people were now dying also by bombs and tank fire and drone attacks and air attacks. But they were now also dying from the cold, from lack of food. Babies died of starvation and of dehydration because there was no water. So people said it needs to have humanitarian assistance. And crucially, in the last 6-8 months of that movement, during the time that part of that movement became what was known as the movement for the uncommitted vote, they also said, and stop sending the weapons. That a ceasefire means you stop sending what it takes to go to war. And people understood that in a whole new way. So that in, I guess it was November of last year, just a few months ago, the polls were something we had never seen before. Those of us who have done this work for, shall we say, far longer than I care to remember. Don't laugh, Marty, you're as old as I am. This is something that we had never seen. 61% of the entire population, voting population, said no more arms to Israel. 77% of Democrats, President Biden's own party. And what did he say? He said, I am a Zionist, and I'm going to continue to send all the weapons that Israel needs. And I'm telling them they should, not kill so many. That's not okay. And people said that's not okay. And it gave rise, as you know, to this movement called the Uncommitted, which was an extraordinary creative part of this movement. People saying during the primaries, I can't make this choice between what I see as fascism on the one hand and the notion of supporters of genocide on the other hand. I'm going to vote uncommitted. I'm going to say I'm not committing, me as a longtime Democrat or me as a progressive whatever. I'm not going to vote for the person coming from the party in power because the party in power is enabling genocide. And it was a really hard decision. I know for myself, if I had, when it came to the general election, if I lived in a swing state, I don't quite know what I would have done. It would have been really, really hard. I live in Washington, D.C., where I have no vote for members of Congress, but I do get to vote for president. It's the only thing I get to vote for. Soon we won't even be able to vote for mayor, it assumes. But usually we can vote for mayor. But nationally, we can only vote for president. But the deal is there, it's a very one-sided population. So those who are critics can safely vote uncommitted or vote for Gaza or vote for justice or whatever you choose, and it will not change what happens to the I think it's 3 electoral votes that Washington, D.C. has. Maybe it's a little more than that, not much. So it was an extraordinary movement in its size, in its breadth. Again, these were people who had often never come out into the streets before for anything. It was an amazing moment. And a lot of these were people with proximity to power. We had, quietly, members of Congress saying, God, I wish I could come out and march with you. And some did. The bravest ones did. Most of them didn't. A few that were not so brave were at least feeling guilty enough to call their supporters and say, God, I really wish I could be out there, but, I just can't. It's like, yeah, you actually can. Look at these polls. You actually could. And it's, among other things, it's not even going to make you lose the election. But you know what? If you lost the election, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world either. Because sometimes there are questions of principle that have to be taken seriously. So in the context of that movement, we had the student movement, the students, which was such an extraordinary phenomenon that we had not seen in a generation. We've seen student participation, social movement that has happened forever. That's true. But a movement where the student component of it was so central, was so powerful, so creative. You know, I was at several of these encampments at various places. There was one of the encampments was going through the period of Passover. And so those of us who were Jewish participated in a Seder that the kids that were running the encampment, Palestinian kids, I shouldn't say kids, sorry, the Palestinians, Jewish people, everybody who was there came together in building a Seder, building a kind of unity. People did teach-ins because it was one of the things that people realized a lot of people had never had the opportunity to take seriously learning some of this history. Frankly, it's why I wrote that book. It's actually not just a revised version of my last book. It's a whole new book. But part of it was for all those people in the ceasefire movement who came out as human beings because of what they were seeing, and then later said, you know, I really should learn what this is all about, how this happened, what is this? And the same for some of these incredible young people who came out for the same reasons on their college campuses and are paying such an incredible price. We're seeing it particularly at Columbia, as you know, but it has spread all over the country. If you compare this to 2017, when Trump came into power the first time and announced a Muslim ban, the absolute ban of entry to this country from people from Muslim-majority countries. And people said, what? No, we are not going to allow that to happen. And massive numbers of people came out to airports to protest. And on campuses, the leadership of the campuses, the president of the campus, the deans, all of them came out and said, not with our students, you don't. You're not going to you're not going to make us expel our students and deport them. That is not going to happen on our watch. Unfortunately, this round, the leadership on too many campuses did not say that. They said, okay, what do we need to do? Because what was happening on the campuses was that supporters of Israel were too often equating being made to feel uncomfortable, which they clearly were, with somehow being threatened, which in almost every case they were not. Were there some individual cases where somebody might have been threatened? Absolutely. But was that the main phenomenon that we saw? No. So people like me and others, so many of the activists in these movements were Jewish, and we had all grown up supporting Israel because it was part of the culture we grew up in. We didn't challenge it. You know, for me, when I was young, when I sort of did a little bit more research and said, wait a minute, I never learned this part in Sunday school, and made the break with supporting Israel, the break with Zionism. I was growing up to be a Zionist youth leader. I was the camp counselor. I worked at the youth group. You know, that was my life. That was my social engagement. That was all that stuff. And so it's not easy. It's very uncomfortable to be confronted with, you know that what's going on here is not really what you learned. There's a whole part that was left out, right? That's hard. It's uncomfortable. It's not fun. And it's, in my view, precisely what college is meant to provide, is challenging ideas, right? And overwhelmingly, that's what has been happening on the campuses. And what we see now is what has been happening to Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia, where it's now spread beyond this question of students. You know, here's a guy, he's coming home to his dorm apartment with his wife, who's 8 months pregnant and happens to be an American citizen. They come in, two guys push in behind them in plain clothes and said, we need to talk to you. And it's like, who are you? Never identified themselves, just said, we're here officially to arrest you because we're taking away your student visa. He said, I don't have a student visa. I have a green card. I am a lawful permanent resident. And they said, oh, well, then that's being revoked too. They had no idea. He gets his lawyer on the phone. The lawyer is talking to one of these ICE agents, and she says, I need to see a warrant. And they hung up on her. You know, this is the chaos of how this is playing out. But the dangers of this, You know, how many of you have heard of Project 2025? Ooh, a lot of you, that's good. So you know how dangerous it could be. This is a very explicit plan developed by a set of right-wing, brilliant intellectuals based around the Heritage Foundation about what a second Trump administration should and could do. Stuff that they never dreamed of in the first administration. Well, part of that project is a separate one that was also done by the same people, known as Project Esther. Project Esther is a call to destroy, and they're quite, overt about this, it's not hidden, to destroy the Palestinian rights movement. Partly because I think it's seen as low-hanging fruit in the context of universities, which have been a long-standing enemy of the right wing, because this is where you learn challenging ideas, that sort of thing. And the context of Project Esther includes things like arresting international students who might support protests against Israeli actions. Well, protesting against Israeli actions is not illegal, right? But they're calling for, and it's working because it's now happening, that we can make it illegal if we say that it is the same as supporting terrorism. And the irony, of course, is that in doing this, what they do is to weaponize the claim of anti-Semitism in a way that completely ignores the real anti-Semitism, which is on the rise. There is real anti-Semitism on the rise in this country. We saw it in Pittsburgh with the murder of 11 Jews at prayer. We saw it in San Diego. We saw it in Charlottesville, where you had explicit neo-Nazis with their tiki torches marching and chanting, "Jews will not replace us." That is real anti-Semitism that puts Jews at risk. And that is the anti-Semitism that comes out of white supremacy and the racist movement. And in that context, the work to oppose and destroy that kind of real anti-Semitism is absolutely ignored in favor of the fake claims of anti-Semitism of people who are condemning Israeli violations of international law and calling for Palestinian rights. So that's what we're dealing with now. I want to say just two other things. One is that I think for those of us in the US, it's really hard to figure out what's our role in all this, because we don't have any say, it seems, in what happens to our tax dollars, right? More than half of our tax dollars already go to the military. Of the discretionary money that Congress can allocate, more than half, it's about 52%, go directly to the military, the Pentagon and the nuclear arsenal. It's unbelievable. If you add to that border, quote, security, mass deportations, you get 62% of the entire discretionary budget. There's wonderful trade-off information if you want to look at the website of the National Priorities Project that goes through this stuff about the military budget. But in that context, what's our role? And here I think we can look at the model of South Africa, not only because they took this really principled political position to say, we need to hold Israel accountable for its violations of, in this case, the International Covenant Against Genocide. And they brought a case to the International Court of Justice. But if we look at the anti-apartheid movement, that was part of what led to the overthrow of apartheid in the early 90s. In the 1980s, there was a global movement against apartheid South Africa. And it took very seriously the question of resolutions that were passed in the General Assembly, which in this case, the same thing happened. After the International Court of Justice issued their preliminary ruling, they haven't yet issued a final ruling, they haven't even had the final hearings yet, but in their preliminary ruling, they said, we don't have the power of enforcement, so we're turning it over to the United Nations. Well, in the UN, the only official enforcement comes in the Security Council. That lasted about a minute when the US said, don't be ridiculous. Of course this is going to be vetoed. Don't even bother bringing it up. And basically they didn't. I mean, everybody knew it was not going to happen there. So they brought it to the General Assembly. And the resolution goes even beyond what the International Court of Justice called for. And what happened was it passed overwhelmingly, 124 in favor, I think it was 7 against, something like that. And in that context, this is just what happened with South Africa. But people then have a tool, an instrument, those resolutions, to take to our own governments, and this happened all over the world, where people, whether it was in Chad or in Belgium or in Hong Kong or wherever it was, people went to their own governments armed with this resolution to say, the General Assembly can't enforce this, but we, as the people of this country, want our government to do what international law and the General Assembly say we should do. And eventually, enough countries started to do those things, sanctioning South Africa, sanctioning apartheid, refusing arms sales, refusing arms purchases, all of that. We can do the same thing here. Because our demand that's been going on for a long time is to stop sending weapons. But now we have a General Assembly resolution calling on us to push our government for precisely that. That gives us the power for this. Trump has just asked for another $8 billion, even while he says, no, I think that, we're going to have negotiations. Well, if you're having negotiations, why are you arming one side? So we have a lot of work to do. And I hope that we can talk about what we might do to make that work happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I'm calling up Professor David Green to offer some responses. Time sort of flew. But so when Professor Green is done, we're going to open up the floor to students with a priority for student questions. I think given the topic, I'm sure we'll have plenty of student questions. All right. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. Stay there, please. I was asked to give a reaction to Phyllis's comments, and when I was asked, I sort of immediately thought, well, first of all, my reaction is probably going to be, you're right. And secondly, whatever specifically she said, she was going to have far more expertise than I would. So, and it turns out I was right on both of those reactions. So if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is offer my own thoughts on the conflict in the Middle East today. And they dovetail, I think, kind of nicely with yours. I think you're absolutely right about taking a historical perspective and that where you start really matters. So I'm going to go back even a little bit further than you did. And I think also my perspective will lean a little bit more into kind of international relations scholarship and that perspective. So let me try to talk about that. And I think this is a really important thing to do because I think it's really easy to lose the forest for the trees when you think about, for example, October 7th, or even the much longer period that has entailed the destruction of Gaza, to lose the bigger picture here. And we could date this back, I think, even thousands of years, but from my perspective, the current clash in the Middle East it looks to me like sort of the tail end remnant of a conflict that's about 150 years old. And from that longer perspective, it strikes me as essentially, if I were, say, a military leader, as what I might describe now as a mopping up operation. The story is obviously complex in many ways, but I think it's also profoundly simple in the sense that I think ultimately it reduces down to two people contending for a single piece of land. So to my mind, one of the clearest lessons of history is that the Jewish people have to have a homeland. They have to have a state, a government, an effective military, and boundaries that that state can protect. If you know anything about the persecution of Jews, not just the Holocaust, but prior to that as well, that seems to me a given. Now, where that state should have been located was certainly debatable in 1947, and one can see, I think, good arguments for locating that state in Palestine and also good arguments for locating it elsewhere. Today, of course, that question of where the Jewish homeland would be located is a moot point. What has happened before 1947 and especially after has been a struggle, it seems to me, over three questions. First, whether there would be a Jewish state. Secondly, if there was, how it would relate to its neighbors. And thirdly, what would be its geographical extent. I think today, as we survey the situation, the first two questions have now more or less been answered. And I think we have a partial answer to the third question. There clearly is a Jewish state, and it's not going away. They fought in alliance to destroy Israel, including wars in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982, and we could add more to the list. The upshot is that Israel won these wars, and its neighbors have, one by one, given up the fight, come to terms with the country's existence, and made peace. This began with Egypt and Jordan going back to the 1970s, and now includes most of the countries in the region in one fashion or another, including, one might say remarkably from the longer-term perspective, Saudi Arabia. The remaining question then is the geographical extent of the state of Israel, and I think this question has two components. The first relates to the territory of Palestine and what will become of the Palestinian people, and the second concerns the greater aspirations of Israel. With respect to that latter question, many Zionists, including the founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, have claimed that the Jewish state is entitled to all the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. That would entail today Israel gobbling up pieces of its neighbors' territory, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Now, not long ago, most people would have dismissed this idea as an old-fashioned, sort of very fringe and generally ludicrous notion. But of course, today the right-wing fringe is running the government in Israel and also in its enabler, the United States. So if you have a crystal ball with you today and you can look into that and tell me what the Middle East looks like at the end of the 21st century, and it is the case that a greater Israel has come to fruition, and that includes all the land that I just mentioned from the Nile to the Euphrates, I can't tell you that I would be entirely surprised. There is clearly that aspiration, and elements of the Israeli government absolutely aspire in that direction. In the meantime, there's the other component to the geographical question that I mentioned, which is the more immediate issue of the Palestinians. Here, I think Israel has been playing the long game. It began at its birth by forcibly evicting Palestinians from their homeland, and this has been documented by even Jewish Israeli historians such as Benny Morris. Israel did so again in large numbers when it occupied neighboring territories following the 1967 Six-Day War. And it continues to do that to this day, as we speak, colonizing more and more of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Golan and possibly even Gaza, although Gaza, of course, is now more or less rubble. Honestly, at this point, it seems to me that you pretty much have to be willingly naive to see those actions as anything other than a process of slow and steady imperialism. And there are many giveaways to this, but the simplest one is to ask, how is Israel's security enhanced by building schools and parks and libraries and synagogues in the middle of the Arab West Bank? The answer is, of course, it's not. Just the opposite would be true, which reveals that these settlements, and the name settlements also reveals that these are colonies for the purposes of grabbing land. For their part, the Palestinians have been dealt, I think, a lousy set of cards to play, but I think you can also make a good argument that they have made strategic blunders of their own. First, by choosing weak and corrupt leadership. Second, by not accepting deals that were lousy from their perspective, but arguably the best that they could hope to get. Third, by not cultivating public opinion in the United States adequately. And fourth, by resisting largely through violent means rather than nonviolent protest, although clearly there's been some of both. On the other hand, as I mentioned, Israel is playing the long game. The question to my mind then is, how long has Israel been playing the long game? Or put differently, was Israel ever serious about sharing Palestine with a Palestinian state as the UN required when it authorized the creation of Israel? I don't know the answer to that question, and I suspect there's a different answer, say, in 1966 than there is in 2000, let alone 2025. But here's what I do know, and I find this particularly instructive, that in 2002, almost a quarter century ago now, Israel's Arab neighbors offered it a deal in which all of those neighbors heretofore completely hostile to the very existence of Israel and fighting all those wars to try to eject Israel from the territory. All those neighbors agreed that they would accept Israel's right to exist. They would recognize Israel as a sovereign state and normalize relations. And the only thing that they asked in exchange was that Israel would give back the occupied territories and allow for the creation of a Palestinian state, just as the UN, as the UN had required. So from the long perspective that I've been trying to take today, this should be seen as essentially defeated combatants suing for peace by giving up almost all of their wartime aspirations, the Arab states, that is. I think it tells us something important, that Israel walked away from this deal. Today, of course, we are much further away from an imaginable peace arrangement than we were in 2002. And I find myself very often, as a professor of international relations, reverting back to Thucydides' observation 2,500 years ago, and thinking more and more that, unfortunately, regardless of questions of justice and law and equity, that he was onto something. Thucydides, of course, famously boiled down relations between people as something along the lines, the strong do what they want to do, and the weak must endure what they must endure. Right now, Israel is strong. It is also backed unconditionally, as Phyllis pointed out, by an even stronger power. The Palestinians, on the other hand, are weak and divided. Ironically, I don't think today either side wants to share the region of Palestine, or what is known as the so-called two-state solution, and that solution thus looks further away than ever, to my mind. We may get to a peace in the future in Palestine, but if we do, my guess is it'll look more like a Pax Romana, that is, a peace that's induced from above with power crushing any form of dissent. I'd like to leave you on a more hopeful note, but I have to be honest with you and say that I've never been less hopeful about the Middle East situation than I am today. Sorry. Thank you.
I'm not sure, false hope might not be very useful for us. So I want to open it up to questions. I'm going to invite students to the microphone. I'm going to invite Phyllis back up. We're just kind of convening. So Phyllis is only here with us today. So I want to encourage questions to Phyllis. But we won't like make you sit down if you ask a question to Professor Green. But we do, yeah, right. But Professor Green is here and teaches lots of classes, has won multiple teaching awards, so you are all encouraged to take his classes. So I invite students up to the microphone, and I'll leave it with you, and then I'll kind of give you a timeout, like, sure, because 2:25 is what. Okay.
There we go. Hi. I just want to say thank you so much for coming here and educating us. I think it's very hard to find correct information, so it's helpful to have an expert. I'm a sustainability major for context, and so I've been very in tune with what's been happening. Back in I think it was January 9th, 2024 is when this was published. Guardian published an article that in the first 2 months of the bombing, that emissions from the war in Gaza have an immense effect on the climate catastrophe. And that was just in the first 2 months. And as we know, that hasn't stopped, and it's probably only gotten worse. And that's going to have an immense effect on the global climate. And also and this from October 8th, 2024, it's estimated about 800,000 tons of asbestos has been released. And that's going to have effects for generations. As we know, I'm a New Yorker, 9/11, I still know people that have been dying, and it's been decades, so we can only imagine what that will do. So since we already know this is affecting the physical global climate, I just want to ask, what do you believe this will do or is doing to the global political climate?
Sorry. See, it belongs here, not up there. That's a wonderful question. What she said, that's the answer. You know, the global political climate is very toxic right now, and it's getting worse, not better. The rise of authoritarianism, the binding together of these authoritarian rulers all over, including our own, including Netanyahu. It's very, very dangerous. I think that the refusal to take seriously the environmental impact, this goes to the question of, the Trump version of what should happen in Gaza. Well, just get them out, ethnic cleansing. Just do that. Just get them out. Then we can just clear it out, and we'll have the Riviera on the Mediterranean. Really. There's something, I forget the number because it's one of these huge numbers, 52 billion tons of rubble. Is that right? Or is it much more than that? It's some huge number. You probably have it in that same article. Yeah. I can't even remember what it is. But it's an unfathomable number of tons of rubble. So one of the questions I keep grappling with, and nobody really talks about this, is, there's talk about who's going to pay for it and who's going to pay for bringing in the dump trucks and things. Well, okay, those are important questions. But where is it going to go? Are they going to dump it into the ocean and make it into a toxic island off the coast of Gaza? So all the fish die and the fishermen can't fish anymore? I mean, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-bending. So I don't think there's an easy answer. And I think that it goes to this question of it's not entirely an exception, but it's part of the Israel exceptional notion that Israel has had a pass until South Africa's move at the ICJ. Israel was never held accountable. And accountability is everything, let alone the U.S. being accountable for how we've enabled all of this. But there was this refusal because Israel claimed its right as part of its population having been the victim of an earlier genocide. And therefore, anything it does cannot be criticized. Edward Said, the great Palestinian scholar, wrote about this, the challenge for Palestinians being the victims of victims. The problem is Israel is no longer a victim state. Israel is one of the wealthiest and in the region, the most powerful state. It's a nuclear-armed state, unacknowledged but widely known. So, it's this insanity of how this goes forward without any accountability. So I think that the challenge is to make sure that in this process of opening the question of accountability, whether it's through the International Court of Justice, through the General Assembly, through the International Criminal Court, in all of these ways, and especially in the court of public opinion, where we have seen extraordinary shifts, as I was citing before in some of these statistics, some of these polls, it goes directly to this. I'll answer your Thucydides quote with a Tacitus quote, which is what he said was the Romans brought devastation and they called it peace. Israel, with the U.S., have brought devastation to Gaza, and they're saying now we're going to call it a resort. This is a huge thing. But I'm very glad that you raised the question of the environment, because as you see in my presentation and in others, David's too, we don't talk about the environmental impact nearly enough, not nearly enough. So that's a huge one. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
Hello. My name's Hannah. First off, thank you for coming today. I wanted to talk about something that you talked towards the beginning that really caught my attention. Something that I know you also put in the last question, like commonly known as someone who grew up very much in a similar way in my synagogue, going to Sunday school, doing all that. That Israel is seen Israel's like extremely powerful. It's like you have to go and everyone gets enrolled in the military for a certain amount of time. They have a very strong economy, a strong military presence. And I was just wondering, how could the narrative be pushed that they are seen as weak in the U.S. when there's like proven facts that they're not seen as weak? Because I have had this conversation a couple times where there's been the same answer from one side where it's just, oh, they're weak, but also like they're very strong, and you can't have a weak military and a very strong military in the same moment. That's physically impossible. So I was wondering, how could that narrative still be pushed out?
Really good question, and a hard one. I would challenge you on one thing. I think you can have a strong military that is very weak at the same time. And I would give you the example of the United States in Vietnam. We had the strongest military in the world, and I refer you to Rusty's book about this, Professor Eisenberg's book about Vietnam and the impact of the anti-war movement on how decisions got made in the Nixon administration in particular. But the key thing was the U.S. kept winning every battle, and it still lost the war because it wasn't a battle that could be won militarily. So you can have both of those things. I would also say, and this is one area where I disagree with David's point at the beginning about the question of Jewish safety. I don't take as a given. In fact, I challenge the notion that Jewish safety requires domination of a state. I believe that Jewish safety can only happen when everybody is safe and everybody has security equally. And that means, for the same reason that Zionism, the move to create a Jewish state in what was then Palestine at the turn of the century, in the turn of the 20th century, was very much a minority position among Jews across Europe, because they believed, the Bundists and others believed, that the way to fight against anti-Semitism, which was rampant — my grandfather came from Minsk in what was then Russia, is now Belarus, fighting to escape the pogroms — they believed that the way to be safe was to get support from everybody else in the country, in the region, in the whatever it was, not this idea that the only way we can be safe is to dominate everybody else, which was the view of Zionism. No, but okay. You said a homeland.
The existence, not the domination.
Okay, I'm just saying a Jewish state, to me, means domination, just like saying a white state in the U.S. would be what it started out to be once you wiped out the majority of the native people, and before you brought in large numbers of African slaves. It was overwhelmingly white, and it was designed to be. That was.
It depends on where you put it. But if you put it somewhere where nobody was, you would just have a Jewish state.
Yeah, but okay, that's true. There could have. He's saying that it could have been a state somewhere else, which is certainly true. You could have, and it would have been just to give Poland or Germany to those Jews who had escaped the Holocaust or who had survived. That would have been just in a certain way. But it still, in my view, is not the way you keep Jews who are all around the world safe. I think you keep Jews safe by making everybody safe. So we can argue that one later. But I think just on your point, Hannah, this does go directly to the question of how do we see going forward? I mean, this is the challenge. And I think that, the notion of, people ask me a lot, well, do you believe Israel has the right to exist? I don't think countries have rights. I don't think France has the right to exist. The US certainly doesn't have the right to exist, given what we did to create this place. But we're here. We're not going anywhere. So nobody is saying, I won't say nobody. I'm not saying that anybody should be leaving. The question is, what's the nature of it? And that's why the anti-apartheid movement that has come from Palestinian civil society through the BDS movement and others, the Palestinian anti-apartheid movement, as it's known, have a very good website for those of you looking for resources on this, modeled after the anti-apartheid movement during the period of apartheid South Africa, is so important as a model to say, from my own view as an analyst, I don't think I agree with David on this. 2 states is over. Whether it was a good, bad, or indifferent idea, it ain't going to happen. There's too many settlements. There's no land. That's done. So the question is, what does happen? What exists now is one state. It's an apartheid state. So how do we deal with that? For me, it means building an anti-apartheid movement that aims at one person, one vote in the entire territory that is controlled by the one government, which controls all of what is now Israel, all of the West Bank, all of Gaza, all of occupied East Jerusalem. All of that together is one state, but with different levels of legal structures, depending on race, religion, national origin, all those factors that go into the international law definitions of apartheid, the International Covenant Against the Crime of Apartheid. So I think there's a lot of ways of looking at this, but at the end of the day, this is about how do we get some kind of justice. But in the immediate, it's about how do we stop a genocide. And that comes back to us in terms of the work of stopping the arms deals that enable it, that make it possible. So I think that's our job. You know, you guys, are most of you registered to vote here in Long Island? So you've got to struggle with your members of Congress. There's some work to be done. There's some education to be done. You know, with their staffs to teach them some of what you know. Take David's classes, take, you know, all of these classes here, and read my book. You know, you'll learn some of the stuff that we didn't, as kids, learn in Sunday school. And it's a lot of what was left out. There's a big, rich history of what was left out. I would just add one other point, which goes to this issue of colonialism, because I think this is the critical question. Settler colonialism, the kind of colonialism that we have here in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, where you had whole populations being transferred from one country to settle another country, with the result that the indigenous people of that territory were either wiped out, like here, or moved off the land, like in Palestine, or entrapped in a system of apartheid, like in South Africa. There's different ways, but all of them came out with the domination of the settlers who moved in. This was also something that was talked about in the works of Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism. In his diaries, not in his book on the Jewish state, but in his diaries, he wrote about the letters that he sent when he was trying to get support from the British Crown for the idea of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. And he wrote these letters to Cecil Rhodes, who was the infamous British colonialist for whom Rhodesia was called Rhodesia for so long, and for whom the Rhodes Scholarships are still named. Those of you trying to get a Rhodes Scholarship, keep that in mind. You should still get one, it's good, but you know, just remember that part. But he wrote to Rhodes and he said, I'm asking you to help me get support from the British Crown for this project. And then he says, you might wonder, why am I asking you? You're interested in Africa, I'm interested in what he called this little slice of Arabia. You're concerned about Englishmen, I'm concerned about Jews. So why am I asking you? And then he answers his own question and he says, because our projects are both something colonial. So he had no illusions. Colonialism at that time was not anything to be ashamed of particularly. There was no consciousness of that. It was just what was. And Palestine was one of them. So I see people standing up. That always means we're done here.
Last chance.
For students. Students get a last chance.
Yeah, so we're going to, people have to get to their next class. So thank you very much, Phyllis.